the latest row that has broken out in relation to what's going on in Gaza it's incredible, to be honest with you. A spat has broken out between, in fact, it's too trivial to call it a spat. An argument has broken out between the UK and the Israeli government over their handling of aid being sent to Gaza that isn't getting to Gaza. And the specifics of the argument that we've seen in the last day or two relate to who is to blame for that. The chair of the the Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee accused Israel of not doing enough to facilitate the paving of aid. That led to a response, and this was a few days ago now, by Eylon Levy, an official spokesperson for the Israeli government on Twitter, who made the accusation in direct response that rather than it being Israel's fault, the UN had asked for the border crossing in which that aid was being transferred to be closed on Saturdays because it was struggling to distribute all the aid that was piling up. Now, that's a pretty big claim that the UN had asked for a reduction in efforts designed to get aid into Gaza. It seems that it's totally untrue. At least that's the confirmation today from David Cameron, no less, the Foreign Secretary of this country, who, in response to the chair of that committee, who we'll speak to in a moment, said this: "I can confirm that the UN has not requested that the Kerem Shalom crossing is closed on Saturdays. It is our understanding that Israel closes it due to the Sabbath." So you basically have the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom accusing an Israeli government spokesperson of either being wrong or having outright lied. It's quite an incredible state of affairs. Of course, the thing that really matters here is the fact that aid is still not getting into Gaza in anything like the quantities that it should be. And it's that, among other reasons, that has led Canada's parliament today to vote to threaten to suspend arms supplies to Israel unless it starts to take this issue far, far more seriously. Britain has also reportedly warned Israel that it could follow suit, that it could also withhold weapons if the Red Cross is not given access to imprisoned Hamas fighters. David Cameron reported to have warned Israeli officials that an arms embargo would be declared across Europe if Israel carries on the way that it is. My question to you is a simple one. Should we wait? Should we wait for Israel to meet certain conditions, or have you seen enough over the last few months to say that the UK should stop arms supplies to Israel now, and indeed perhaps should have done so long ago? Call me, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp that number too. You can text 84850. Come to your calls on that very shortly. Let's first speak to the woman, the MP at the heart of that row. Alicia Kearns is chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Conservative MP for Rutland and Melton. Alicia, great to have you on the show tonight. Thank you for coming on. I mean, the response to your letter from Lord David Cameron today, seemingly completely debunking this claim from an Israeli government spokesperson. It's a quite an extraordinary state of affairs. What's your assessment of it?
So I'm pleased to have him give such complete clarity. I seem to have ended up in the middle of an argument with the Israeli government that I was surprised to be having. I was in Al Arish, which is the town on the border with Palestine from Egypt, where all the aid is piled up, and we are talking thousands of trucks just sat there full of aid waiting to go in. I saw the aid that had been declined, everything from neonatal resuscitation kits, all the way through to boxes that stored children's books, all the way through to crutches, wheelchairs, and maternity kits that had all been rejected on the border, including, as David Cameron says in his letter today, tons of British provided aid. And so I came back and reported very straightforward on what I was seeing and my frustrations that more aid could be getting in. And the Israeli spokesperson decided to come in on my Twitter and make various points that I knew to be factually inaccurate. And I asked him for evidence about them. And then, knowing him to be wrong, I wrote to David Cameron asking him to correct them. And I'm pleased today that he's put that on record.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he knowingly lied, Alicia?
Unfortunately, I find it very difficult to come to any other conclusion, because he said that the UN demanded that the crossing was closed on Saturdays. Now, I knew that not to be the case, because the UN themselves had told me that that was a requirement of the set by the Israeli government, that it was not to be open on that day. And of course, I had spoken to the Egyptian government. I had spoken to the British government about this when I returned, who had confirmed that to be the case. So for him to say something that was outright so easy to confirm to be untrue. And the other point that I found really distasteful was his claim that the UK government should, in his words, test us. He said, send 100 more trucks a day and we will get them through, test us. This is not a game. People are starving on the ground. And there are issues within Gaza. There is aid being stolen. There is not enough vehicles to be able to move aid around. And again, Israel is not allowing many humanitarians to have their visas approved so they can go in. However, this is a very, very serious issue. And the reality is the majority of the problem sits on the Israeli side of the border, where they are not opening the gates for long enough. They are putting on essentially on a day-to-day basis, the rules of what can and can't go in are being changed. They are not open for enough days, and they are not open for enough hours. And David Cameron's been very explicit about that in his letter to me today.
He has indeed. He says he is incredibly frustrated that this aid isn't going in. He says routinely being held up, waiting for Israeli permissions. Is it impossible to conclude anything other, Alicia, than Israel simply doesn't want this aid to reach the people of Gaza?
So Israel legitimately has concerns about dual-use products. So, for example, I saw a number of solar lamps that, yes, I can understand why the Israeli government wouldn't want those coming in, because why would you have solar lamps? Because it would help, particularly in the tunnels, if you needed to light them. However, the idea that British aid provided by the UK government, an ally of the Israeli government, should be sitting for 3 weeks on the border when there are children drinking puddles, there are humanitarian workers living off animal feed, is absolutely wrong. So unfortunately, it is clearly within Israel's capacity and capability to open the gates for longer, to let more aid in. It is clearly within their powers to switch back on the water. David Cameron said that in front of my committee in January. Still now in March, he is still calling for the water to be switched back on. This is a humanitarian crisis, and the reality is the Israeli government can do more because it has obligations under international law to do more.
The British government's calling for a lot of things. You've been calling for a lot of things. Joe Biden's calling for a lot of things. Is the Israeli government listening to anybody, in your view?
So we have to recognise that there are limits to our ability to affect change, even amongst our closest allies, but also that although we are calling for many things publicly, there will also be arrangements that are being successful. So, for example, many people expected Israel to push into Lebanon. Now, it may be that the reason why there have been no operations in Lebanon is because the UK and the US said that was a red line and there were to be no ground operations to Lebanon. There has not been an operation to Rafah as yet, and that is because, again, the UK and the US have said that should not happen until there is a proper plan in place and a plan for the 1.7 million people in that very tiny space. There is a limit to how many areas in which the UK and the US can say, this is an area that you will not push on, this is a limit for us, this is a red line for us. And that is a reality check that I think people don't want to believe. And also the reality is the Israeli people are hurting. What they went through was truly outrageous. It was a crime against humanity. And therefore, it is a difficult environment currently within Israel. However, Israel's right to defend itself is not limitless in international law. And this is what we are seeing. The international community saying your commitments are not being upheld and their frustrations are best demonstrated by the construction of this maritime humanitarian corridor. That is a distraction. It is not going to work, and it is going to work, but incredibly slowly, and it is not necessary because enough aid could be going in by truck if it was allowed.
You get the impression that patience is fast running out amongst Israel's allies. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's absolutely a fair assessment.
What can we... How damaging is that, first of all, Alicia, to our relationship with them? It's evolved. It's changed quite a lot over the 4 or 5 months this conflict's been going on. Is it, how would you assess the relationship between the UK and Israel now?
I think that's very difficult for me to do because ultimately I'm just a backbencher, so I'm not in those daily conversations we are having with the Israeli government. But I think in terms of our support for Israel as a country, that has not changed. We want an Israel that can live in security and stability, that doesn't feel threatened on its borders. We want a Palestinian state who, again, have the same security commitments, who are able to live in freedom and have that stability in the same way as I would call out anyone who denies Israel's right to statehood. We should also call out those who deny Palestinian statehood, because that is the only way we get to peace.
Which includes, of course, and in the same way as Hamas is a huge barrier to peace, but that includes, of course, the incumbent Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has made very clear, as have his allies, that a two-state solution is not something they believe in. How big a barrier is he to peace, do you think, Alicia?
So I think there are real challenges around what is Netanyahu's genuine appetite for a peaceful solution, which therefore has to be a two-state solution. But also he has his own political difficulties. We have to remember in the lead up to October 7th, for 38 weeks in a row, over 100,000 Israelis were out on the streets every single week protesting against the reforms he was making to the judiciary and the way the courts were going to work. There is a big difference between criticising and challenging the way in which Netanyahu has decided to prosecute his defence of Israel and defence of Israel and being a friend to Israel. I do not believe there is anyone in our country who does not want to see an Israel that is secure and look after our Israeli friends and partners. But having valid disagreements based and set in international law with Netanyahu around the way he's prosecuting this, the rhetoric he uses and his government uses when they talk about Palestinians, their behaviour in the West Bank, their support for settlements, it is more than legitimate to have serious concerns about the way in which he is conducting himself and his ambitions and the way his government expresses themselves and behaves and conducts military activities, and Israel itself being a friend and partner that deserves long-term stability and security.
And just going back to patience running thing, Canada voting earlier this week to halt arms sales to Israel, threats from the UK government that it could follow suit. Is that a realistic prospect, do you think, Alicia, that we might cut off support to a country that has been, or still is, a very close ally of ours?
So I think we need to look back to 2014, 2015 when David Cameron was Prime Minister, the last time that we saw a big flare-up, a big crisis in Gaza. David Cameron suspended arms exports to Israel within a month. And so if you look at where we are now and just how much more extreme the situation is, I pushed the government last week and again this week on whether or not our assessment has changed on whether or not international law is being upheld by Israel. And the answer was that we are currently undertaking the assessment and we will report back to the House shortly. If that assessment has changed, and the last one was in December, then there would be a duty upon the government to suspend arms exports because it would know that there was a risk that they weren't being used appropriately. So there are legal ramifications that come from a legal determination. And I would expect, if I'm honest, to hear the government make a public determination on whether international law is still being upheld. The actual determination is whether there is a commitment from Israel to international humanitarian law. If we don't hear that within the week, I would be very surprised.
So this could move quite quickly. By the end of next week, potentially the UK could have ceased arms sales to Israel.
Quite possibly. And obviously there are reasons why you would choose to continue to have certain relationships. I don't know what the current flow has been. For all we know, there may not have been many sales going on at present. It may be that they just haven't formally suspended. I just do not have that detail to hand. But yes, this is an evolving situation. The situation could change at any time. We've obviously had reporting today that Britain will withhold arms exports unless we see access to those being held prisoner by the IDF. There are all sorts of different reasons and exchanges that may be taking place to achieve adherence to international law.
Alicia, great to have you on. Really grateful for your time tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Alicia Kearns is Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and Conservative MP for Rutland and Melton. That's quite a statement, I think, that it is very possible that by this time next week, Britain could have cut off weapons supplies to Israel.